Welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources to dig into today.
Yeah, an in-depth interview alongside 8 project files from MIDERI Architecting.
Right. And our mission here is to figure out how architect Mikel Del Rio's migrant perspective, how it fundamentally drives him to build connections in what feels like an increasingly polarized world.
And to really ground that philosophy, we should probably start exactly where the interview takes
At
place.
Kasernen Basel.
Yeah, the CAFOS. It's this massive 9,000 square meter former military barracks. And it's important context that Mikkel actually co-authored this with HAFO.
Right. They won the 2013 competition together under the name FDRS before they eventually split.
Exactly. And that 45 million franc transformation really sets the thesis for all his work.
It really does. I mean, they took this intensely closed-off defensive military compound and literally cut pathways right through it.
Opening it permanently to the Rhine River and the public. They turned a barrier into, yes, which feels like a pretty direct reflection of his own life, honestly. The interview dives into his binational roots, spending his childhood navigating between Barcelona and Colombia.
He talks about observing his mother's migration for love.
Yeah, and then experiencing his own. When you constantly navigate different cultures like that, you develop this acute awareness of the spaces in between. You just don't fit into a local's neat, predefined box.
So how does that actually translate to bricks and mortar, though? I'm curious how an architect uses that lack of a single cultural box as an actual design tool.
Well, it allows him to approach a site without the baggage of imposing a rigid identity. Because he's comfortable as an outsider, he naturally looks for the spatial and social gaps that locals might overlook.
He adapts to what the context demands rather than forcing the context to adapt to his aesthetic.
Exactly. Which explains his active rejection of the whole architectural ivory tower.
We are so used to famous architects demanding total authorship, creating these highly signature, almost ego-driven monuments.
But that rejection stems heavily from his working class background. Growing up in public schools with an artist mother and blue-collar friends, he felt the friction between elite high architecture and the everyday people who actually use it.
So he is much more interested in building bridges for society?
Right, helping the outsider cross over.
I see that conceptually, but how do you design a building that intentionally rejects an ego-driven identity while still serving a community?
Look at the mechanics of the Bel Air housing project in Geneva. It's designed as an inclusive microcity.
Well, instead of just stacking identical apartments.
Exactly. They engineered specific vertical layers and intersecting public walkways. The architecture physically channels different social demographics to cross paths daily. It structurally guarantees social diversity.
And it scales down, too. The Ivanku's Cafe project turned a totally neglected industrial workshop into what the owner now literally calls a regional living room.
It even scales up to civic structures. Take the Romanshorn Town Hall.
Yeah.
The brief was for a government building, and usually those are designed to project authority.
Which can be incredibly intimidating.
Very. But Very designed a highly abstract, welcoming structure where the public square physically extends right into a 3-story covered foyer.
It totally removes the threshold between the citizen and the state.
Which brings us to this recurring concept in his interview. The idea of saying new sentences with old words.
The alt-new philosophy.
Full new, yeah. It's a brilliant way to look at the tension between architectural authorship and user-defined spaces. Mikel argues that architects build the bridge, but the users define who crosses it.
Because if an architect builds a structure so rigid that it only serves one specific narrative,
What happens when society evolves?
the building breaks, or it just gets torn down.
Exactly. So adaptability becomes the highest form of sustainability. A great example is their proposal for the Kunstmuseum burn.
They were working with the strict constraints of a historic Beaux-Arts building.
Grand, rigid dimensions. But instead of fighting it, they preserved that historic shell and just inserted a completely flexible timber grade inside.
It becomes this adaptable exhibition machine.
Right, where future curators aren't locked into 21st century spatial assumptions.
You see that exact same preservation logic at the Candermat School, unifying disparate structures under a single new roof.
Or at the Swiss Embassy in London, repurposing a 1970s office addition and 19th century townhouses rather than just starting from scratch.
But the Sion Master Plan is really the ultimate proof of concept here.
It really is. They designed parking structures, but the floor plates and ceiling heights are specifically engineered so they can be easily converted into office buildings down the line.
Anticipating changing transit habits. Because at the end of the day, the most sustainable building is the one that doesn't need to be demolished.
When our buildings can adapt, our societies can too.
And bringing it back to you, the physical spaces you interact with daily dictate your community's ability to evolve and connect. We need structures that can bend without breaking.
We absolutely do.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder today. If the most successful architecture acts as an adaptable framework for future stories, what will the highly rigid single-use structures we are building right now force our descendants to do when our current societal narratives inevitably change?